Welcome to Chapter 9. This chapter is on the single participant experimental design. So let's get into it. So we'll start with some examples in history of single participant designs. And so when researchers have done these types of studies, it's normally because they want to see if they can increase or decrease a behavior in a single participant or animal subject. So, for example, you may want to see if you can help someone stop smoking, or you may want to see if you can help someone to exercise more. So researchers can look at increase and decreasing all different types of observable action or behavior. Until about 1935, single participant design was by far the most commonly used research method. And so you may be familiar with these famous single participant designs. Pavlov used a single dog, Watson used a little Albert the baby, Wundt did a lot of work using individual participants to do objective introspection. He would give them images like this apple that you see here and ask a single participant to describe their experience of that apple for hours. So we're going to do a little refresher. If you've seen these examples before, that's okay. It's always good to refresh on them because they're classic studies and experiments done in psychology, and great examples of single participant design. So we're going to start with Ivan Pavlov. He famously used a single participant design to develop classical conditioning, which many of you probably are very familiar with, but we're going to discuss it a little here after we watch a kind of refresher clip from The Office on classical conditioning.
I have to reboot again. Hey, Dwight, do you want an Altoid?
What do you think?
Dwight, want an Altoid?
Okay.
Altoid?
Sure.
What are you doing? What?
I don't know. Well, my mouth tastes so bad all of a sudden.
In 1927, Ivan Pavlov developed the theory of classical conditioning sort of on accident, actually. He had been working on studying salivation in dogs and their stomach acid secretion due to them ingesting different foods. And this was big time science back in 1927. For this, he won a Nobel Prize, I believe in physiology. So the way that he would kind of do these tests on dogs to check out their salivation and stomach acid secretion is that he would kind of attach tubes to their salivary glands, and he would give them food, they would ingest it, and then he would measure how much drool they produced in these little tubes that he had attached to their salivary glands. So every day he had the dogs kind of hooked up to his different instruments, and he would do the same thing, give them the food, they'd eat the food, and then he would collect the drool. Well, he started to notice that just even before the dogs ingested the food, just seeing the food, being presented with the food, would cause them to start drooling. And then to take that even further, one day, as he did every day, he called for his research assistant to bring in the food that he would then present to the dogs. And the woman that would bring the food in, his research assistant, would wear high heels. And every day she would walk down this long corridor that the dog he couldn't see the research assistant, but every day she would wear heels and the dog could hear the click clack of her heels. And soon he associated the click clack of the heels with the idea that food was on its way. And so what Pavlov noticed is that the dog actually started drooling to the footsteps of the research assistant. When he heard the click clack, the dog would begin to drool. So Pavlov very geniusly thought to himself, well, this is fascinating. This dog is drooling to the sound of footsteps. And this kind of spawned this whole classical conditioning theory as Pavlov started to think, well, what else can I get this dog to drool to? And if we can get a dog to drool to the sound of footsteps or maybe bells or buzzers or whistles, what kind of associations have humans made in their environment that maybe they're not consciously aware of? So we're going to go ahead and watch a video now that summarizes classical conditioning, and then after we watch the video, we'll go through and break down all the terminology.
Hey, welcome to Psych IRL. Okay, so definition, what is classical conditioning? Classical conditioning is a learning process that occurs when two stimuli are paired together repeatedly. First, the first stimuli evokes a natural response by the subject, while the second doesn't. But after enough pairings together, the second becomes conditioned and causes the response to happen. Makes sense. So there was this Russian scientist named Ivan Pavlov, and he discovered this by accident. He kept dogs in a lab so he could study their digestive processes. Now, dogs naturally salivate to food. He surgically implanted these devices in the dogs' mouths so that he could measure their saliva. But experiment after experiment, Pavlov noticed that before the food was even presented, the dogs began to salivate. They salivated to the sound of the researcher's footsteps, or even just to the bowl itself. And then Pavlov was like, wait, the dogs are associating the researcher's footsteps or the bowl with food. Footsteps and the bowl have been classically conditioned to evoke the drooling response. After Pavlov found this out, he thought to himself, you know what? I'm gonna classically condition a dog to salivate to a bell. That's really useful for some reason. Dogs naturally salivate to food. Food is an unconditioned stimulus. The dog drooling is the unconditioned response. The sound of the bell is a neutral stimulus because dogs don't naturally salivate to that. Pavlov presented the sound of the bell and the food together over and over and over and over again. After a number of experiments, he just rang the bell. And what do you know? The dogs salivated to the sound of the bell alone. Classical conditioning IRL. So we went into an ice cream store one day. My sister bought this, who is sitting right there in her weird red pajamas. Okay, I don't think I should do that. Ew! I'm putting that part in the video. My sister, who was sitting right there, bought this ice cream called, it was called Brownie Fudge Sundae. So, okay, anyways, it was like some chocolate ice cream called Brownie Fudge Sundae. Because there's this rule in this house that whatever's in the fridge is up for grabs, she tried to eat this whole gallon of chocolate ice cream to herself so that she wouldn't have to share. And what ended up happening was she barfed.
Felt kind of dirty.
Okay.
Sticky.
Okay, stop.
Very, very sticky.
Wait,
and
stop! And now, to this day, she doesn't like chocolate. So now she associates chocolate with being sick. That's called taste aversion. So if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe. And get those A's. Bye!
So what Pavlov discovered was that you could get an organism to respond to something that it wouldn't naturally respond to using classical conditioning. And he observed this through watching the behavior of his dog. Watson read about and studied Pavlov's work and then built on the works of Pavlov by asking himself, well, if we can get a dog to do an action to something it usually wouldn't do an action to, can we also see if human beings can have emotional responses to neutral stimuli? And so Watson really kind of expanded the work of Pavlov by studying, can we evoke emotional responses in people using classical conditioning? And to study this, he did a very famous experiment using a baby known as Little Albert. So let's go ahead and watch the video on Watson's Little Albert experiment.
John B. Watson, known for establishing the behavior school of psychology, carried out one of the most influential psychology studies in the 1920s that would later on be something that would never be forgotten. Classical conditioning, first experimented by Ivan Pavlov, was used on a dog when an unconditional stimulus was used to produce an unconditional response, and a conditioned stimulus was used to produce a conditioned response. This was later on extended by Watson in his demonstration of the Little Albert experiment. In Watson's experiment, a little baby Albert was used to be conditioned. He was born to a woman who was a nurse in the Harriet Lane Home of Invalid Children. Although raised in a hospital environment, Albert developed normally and was very stable. Ivan Pavlov was indeed able to condition a dog. Could Watson now do the same thing in humans? Now to the actual experiment itself. First off, Watson presented little Albert objects that he was not afraid of, objects that Albert initially liked. These included fire, a monkey, a dog, a rabbit, and finally, a white rat. Albert in particular liked the white rat. From all these clips, notice Albert's positive reactions. And now comes the conditioning. To start off the conditioning, when Albert reached to touch the rat, a loud bar was struck whenever Albert reached for the rat. Here, Albert first off fell forward and was startled, but he did not cry yet. But he reached for it for a second time and heard it, and then he started to cry. Watson had indeed conditioned a fear response in little Albert. Albert was then shown a rabbit. He immediately cried and got as far away as possible from it. Then a dog was also brought in. Albert did not cry right away. He was acting cautious, and it was only when the dog came right up to his head that he began to cry and tried to get away from it. After this, a seal fur coat was brought in. Albert turned away from it and was agitated. Then Watson used a Santa Claus mask, in which invoked an even more negative response by baby Albert. From the previous experience from the white rat, little Albert suddenly became afraid of familiar objects that had the same characteristics as the white rat. This phenomenon was known as generalization. Watson then wanted to test whether the reaction would carry over in a different setting. The previous tests were done in a small dark room, but now he was brought into a larger room. He was presented with the same objects but did not show strong symptoms of withdrawal until the objects were paired with a loud noise. Watson now wanted to see if fear could remain in Albert over a period of time, so Albert was brought home and returned in 1 month. When he returned, he was tested with the same objects and paired with the same loud noises. Albert indeed showed the same strong signs of withdrawal. Watson once again proved that he can condition fear into baby Albert. Watson concluded that phobias were most likely conditioned responses. The little Albert study is extremely important in psychology and other disciplines. It has inspired other important researchers of the past and continues to impact the direction of psychological investigation today.
Okay, so as I mentioned, these single participant designs were the most commonly used research method until about 1935. And so in 1935, this gentleman named Fisher published an experimental design book that introduced statistical methods for analyzing data using multiple participants. And this publication really changed the way that many psychologists did research. It introduced the concepts of correlation, ANOVA, z-distribution, and t-tests. At any rate, single participant designs, which were adopted by B.F. Skinner, who we'll talk about more in a second, are used to examine the behavior of a single individual under highly controlled conditions. These are different than case studies where there is no control. Case studies are qualitative in nature, and single participant designs are quantitative. So, the goal of single participant designs is to determine the effectiveness of a particular treatment on changing the strength of a behavior. Nowadays, many researchers use multiple participants in an experiment. As I mentioned on the previous slide, we saw an uptick in multiple participant designs after the statistical analysis book that Fisher wrote came out in 1935. However, Skinner remained the exception to this. He developed an approach to studying behavior called the experimental analysis of behavior. And this is when an individual's behavior is studied over time as the researcher changes the independent variable. Then the experiment is replicated several times using different participants, but each participant is observed on an individual basis. And researchers who use this method are called behavior analysts. So B.F. Skinner is the person in psychology that you should associate with operant conditioning. He kind of came up with or coined the term operant conditioning and developed some apparatus that we still use in psychology to measure and study operant conditioning. And so the apparatus that he developed is called the Skinner box. And the Skinner box allowed him to investigate one of his main interests, which was how behavior varies as a result of alterations within an environment. So when we put a rat inside of this Skinner box, how can we alter or condition its behaviors? So here we have a rat inside of a Skinner box, and what we're attempting to do is get the rat to lever press, as it's called, or push down on that lever you see there. And we can actually train the rat to press the lever by altering several different things within the environment. This particular rat is lever pressing whenever that light is on, but we can also train the rat or condition the rat to lever press when the light is blue but not when it's red, or when a Rihanna song is on but not when a Michael Jackson song is on. And the way we do this is simple. The only time that food will be dispensed from that little box you see the rat's head in is when the light is on, in this case, and when the light is off, no food comes out. So the rat sees the light on, pushes the lever, and then the food comes out. However, if the light is off and the rat pushes the lever, no food comes out. So eventually, the rat learns to only push that lever when the light is on, and the rat won't push the lever when the light is off. And therefore, we have used operant conditioning to train the rat to press the lever only when the light is on. So remember that individual difference is the leading cause of experimental error, or what we call error variance. And so operant designs like B.F. Skinner introduced, and I just showed you with the Skinner box, allow us to have experimental control over that error variance because individual difference is not an issue. There is no difference between your individuals because you only have one individual. And so each individual then acts as their own control, wherein other multiple participant designs, we have to calculate group means and then use statistics to control for that error variance. So we're going to talk more about the concepts in the experimental analysis of behavior that Skinner developed. And we've already mentioned that phrase operant. We're going to talk more about that on the next two slides. And then we're going to talk about all these other terms on this slide: phase, baseline, treatment, length of phase, changing phase, and measuring the response. So these are all concepts in Skinner's experimental analysis of behavior, and now we're going to go through them one at a time. Okay, so there are some more terms in operant conditioning that are very important, and you need to know them. So the first is reinforcer, and it's important to remember that a reinforcer always makes us smile. We always want a reinforcer. So no matter what word I put before the word reinforcer, remember that you always want a reinforcer. Another thing to remember about reinforcers is that they always increase a response. No matter what word comes before the word reinforcer, reinforcers always increase a response, and we always want a reinforcer. We always want a reward. Also, as far as the terms positive and negative, we're not referring to positive as in yay and negative as in boo. We're referring to positive and negative like in math. Positive meaning to add and negative meaning to remove or to subtract. So if you are to give someone a positive reinforcer, what you are doing is you are adding something pleasant, something that makes that person smile, to their environment to increase a behavior. For example, you go to work. At the end of your 2 weeks of work, you're given a paycheck, so that is something added to your environment that makes you smile, and it increases the likelihood that you will respond by coming back to work the next week. So a positive reinforcer is giving something to someone, so adding something to someone's life that's pleasant, that increases a response. Okay, remember that a negative reinforcer is still something we want. We love negative reinforcers. A negative reinforcer means to remove something unpleasant from someone's life to increase a response. So when I was younger, I had chores that I had to do every weekend, the same chores. But if I did well in school that week and came home with a good progress report on Fridays, then my mom would let me take something off my list of chores. This is a negative reinforcer. This is a good thing. I loved that. When I get into my car, if I go more than 20 miles per hour without my seatbelt on, my car starts making a loud, annoying beeping sound. And so to remove that unpleasant sound, I have to put on my seatbelt. And so my car is using negative reinforcement to get me to use my seatbelt. And then we have punishment. So punishment is always something we don't want. Punishment always makes us sad. So no matter what word we put in front of the word punishment, we never want punishment. So even if you hear the phrase positive punishment, this doesn't mean positive like yay. Instead, positive still means to add and negative still means to remove. And another thing that's always true about punishment is it decreases response in the theory of operant conditioning. Positive punishment means to add something unpleasant to someone's life to decrease a response. Like this girl in the picture here, she was talking back to her mama, so her mama added a spanking to her life, which was unpleasant, to decrease the response of back talk. Positive punishment, adding something to someone's life that's unpleasant to decrease a response, to stop a behavior. And then we have negative punishment, and negative punishment means to remove something pleasant from someone's life to decrease a response. So if you've ever been grounded, you've been the victim of negative punishment, the removal of something pleasant from someone's life to decrease a response. A common mistake that people make is saying negative reinforcement as a term for punishment. So don't make that mistake. Remember that negative reinforcement is a good thing. It's not a punishment. It's something that we want. It's the removal of something we don't like doing. So if your parents say that if you're really good this weekend, then you don't have to mow the lawn. This would be an example of negative reinforcement. It's a good thing. We like it. So let's watch a clip from The Big Bang Theory where Sheldon is trying to condition his roommate's girlfriend to act in ways that he approves of using operant conditioning.
Are you finished?
Well, thank you. How thoughtful. Would you like a chocolate?
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
What was that?
You said be nice to Penny. I believe offering chocolate to someone falls within the definition of nice.
It does, but in my experience, you don't.
Oh, sorry, Sheldon. I almost sat in your spot.
Did you? I didn't notice. Have a chocolate.
Thank you.
You're here a lot now.
Oh, am I talking too much? I'm sorry. Zip.
Thank you. Chocolate?
Yes, please. Oh, hey, Kim. Yeah, you know what? Hold on. Let me take this in the hall. You'll never guess who they got to replace you at work.
Okay. I know what you're doing.
Really?
Yes. You're using chocolates as positive reinforcement for what you consider correct behavior.
Very good. Chocolate?
No, I don't want... Sheldon, you can't train my girlfriend like a lab rat.
Actually, it turns out I can.
Well, you shouldn't.
There's just no pleasing you, is there, Leonard? You weren't happy with my previous approach to dealing with her, so I decided to employ operant conditioning techniques, building on the works of Thorndike and B.F. Skinner. Yet by this time next week, I believe I can have her jumping out of a pool, balancing a beach ball on her nose.
No, this has to stop now.
I'm not suggesting we really make her jump out of a pool. I thought the bazinga was implied. I'm just tweaking her personality, just sanding off the rough edges, if you will.
No, you're not sanding Penny.
Are you saying that I am forbidden from applying a harmless, scientifically valid protocol that will make our lives better?
Yes, you're forbidden.
Bad, Leonard. You know, using positive reinforcement techniques, I could train that behavior out of her in a week.
No.
If you let me use negative reinforcement, I can get it done before we go to bed.
You're not squirting her in the face with water.
No, of course not. We're talking very mild electric shocks. No tissue damage whatsoever.
Forget it.
Oh, come on. You can't tell me that you're not intrigued about the possibility of building a better girlfriend.
I'm not. Penny's qualities, both good and bad, are what make her who she is.
Well, I'm going to make some warm milk and then turn in. I trust if you two are planning on engaging in amorous activities, you'll keep the decibel level to a minimum.
Of course.
Thank you.
These are so good.
Unbelievable.
What?
I was just thinking we should probably turn into...
Well, my new bed got delivered. If you come over and put it together, you can stay at my place.
Really? That's a lot of work, and it's kind of late.
Yeah, but if we stay there, we won't have to be quiet.
Let's go.
Interesting. Sex works even better than chocolate to modify behavior. I wonder if anyone else has stumbled onto that.
Okay, so we're going to go over the remainder of these concepts in the experimental analysis of behavior that B.F. Skinner developed. So the first term that we're going to go over from this slide is phase. And phase is the period of time that an individual is studied to see how their behavior changes when different treatments are introduced or withdrawn, taken away, or if they're just changed. So, for example, the entire time that Pavlov studied one dog would constitute what we call a phase. And the next term you need to know is baseline. So the baseline is just the natural level of a behavior before any treatment is introduced. So if you wanted to research if playing video games makes your child more aggressive, you would observe and record them playing the video games and their aggressive behavior before you introduced any type of therapeutic intervention or treatment. So you need to collect just baseline data of how the behavior is naturally before you start to make any modifications or changes with treatment. So treatment is really kind of the reinforcer or the punishment in experimental analysis of behavior. And so if you wanted to get someone to stop drinking alcohol, you could give them antabuse. If they drink antabuse and then drink alcohol, it'll make them vomit violently. So that would be called punishment procedure. So you're kind of using positive punishment as a way to curb alcohol drinking. And then if you wanted to get someone to call you more often and you used compliments when they call as a treatment, this would be called a reinforcement procedure because you're rewarding them for calling you with compliments. So positive reinforcement in an effort to get them to continue to call you down the road. So the next term you need to know is length of phase. And length of phase depends on the stability of the behavior that you're observing. So each phase continues until a behavior is stable or consistent over time. So when Pavlov was observing the dog when the bell was rung and then the dog would drool, once that behavior became consistent over time, meaning every time the bell rang, the dog drooled, you could probably conclude that phase because the behavior is stable at that point. And so from the beginning of the observation to the conclusion would constitute the length of that phase. So within a phase, there is going to be a kind of subphase or a changing phase. And when we introduce withdrawal or change in treatment and a change in behavior starts occurring, so when we ring the bell and the dog starts drooling, we have entered into the changing phase. And we stay in the changing phase until after the behavior has stabilized. So when the behavior is occurring every single time. So the goal is to show that our treatment increases or decreases response during this changing phase. And there's no statistics to analyze if change due to an independent variable was significant. So it's completely subjective whether or not that change has been effective. It's totally up to the researcher, which obviously could cause some concern because of bias. And then the last concept you need to know is measuring the response. So we measure the rate or frequency of responding in a specific period of time. So there's something called a cumulative record of response, and this is where we record frequency and the time at which the operant or voluntary behavior occurred. We display those results on a graph, and then the graph is evaluated to decide if the independent variable had an effect. So in a single participant research design, the baseline is usually referred to by the letter A, and the treatment is referred to by the letter B. So another term you'll need to know is what's called withdrawal, and withdrawal refers to the withdrawal of the treatment in the second phase of A or the baseline. So we're going to look now at what's called an ABA design. And in an ABA design, we gather baseline data. That's where the A comes from. Then we introduce B, which is the treatment, and then withdraw the treatment and measure A again, which is the baseline. So we have baseline, treatment, baseline. And during the baseline, we're just observing the behavior as is, and we're not doing anything to the participant. So we withdraw treatment because we are trying to show that the treatment, which is B, caused a change in A. So it's kind of like a pre-test, post-test. If treatment and only treatment did affect the behavior, then we remove it. When we remove it, the behavior should decrease. If the behavior does not decrease in the second measure of the baseline after withdrawal, then we can establish a cause and effect relationship. Of course, something else may have caused the increase in the behavior, like carryover effects practice, for example. So we need to be cognizant of that and kind of plan for that at the outset. So for example, you could monitor how much someone calls you that would represent A, the baseline. Then introduce complementing, that would represent B, the treatment. And then you withdraw B, so you stop complementing, and that behavior of calling should decrease on the second baseline watch, so the second A. If it doesn't, then they weren't calling because of your treatment. They weren't calling because of your complements. The application of experimental analysis of behavior is often used in behavior modification, which is a therapeutic technique that we commonly see used in psychotherapy or talk therapy. And so we can use behavior modification if we want to help people to stop doing something that's maybe harmful to themselves, like overspending or overeating, or if we want to help them to start doing something like reading more books or exercising. And really the goal of behavior modification is just to improve the quality of someone's life. And it's used for a variety of behaviors that you want to modify, but it can also be used to help combat depression, anxiety, addiction. So one of the ways that we see it in like couples therapy is if a couple fights a lot, what they'll do is they'll go to the therapist for help, and before the therapist starts making any suggestions on what they should do with their behavior, the therapist will have them collect baseline data. So they'll write down their interactions for like a 2-week period. Generally, they have them write down what was going on before, during, and after the argument. And so that kind of journal they collect for 2 weeks of their observations is going to be a measure of their baseline, so A. And then the therapist will review that data from their journal. They'll find, let's say, that the fights occur when chores don't get done, for example. And so the therapist will have the couple make a list of chores, assign a point value to each chore in terms of difficulty, and then divide them up evenly. So this act would constitute the treatment, or B. And so then you would have them again record their interactions for 2 weeks. And so you would kind of be observing their behavior again. So another A, another baseline observation after the introduction of that treatment. But the problem with kind of leaving it there with the ABA withdrawal design is that we don't want the new desirable behavior to stop or the undesirable behavior to start again. So we would need to use a type of ABAB design where there is another kind of ongoing treatment. So one of the things they could do is have a rule that if either fails to do a chore, the couple has to put $1 in a jar for the other to spend. And so that would represent the second treatment, and then we would have an ABAB withdrawal design. In ABAB withdrawal designs, the replication of the effect is seen in the second treatment phase, so that's second B. But in multiple baseline designs, the replication of the effect is seen in another behavior or another individual or another setting. So there's something called multiple baseline across participants. And the idea with that is that if we can establish a change in 2 people with the same target behavior, like stopping an addiction or starting to exercise, then we can be confident that our treatment is the thing that caused the change, because we've seen the change occur in more than one person. For example, what if a teacher wants to know the impact of fluency training for 2 students in his or her classroom? So a pre-intervention reading fluency baseline is established for 2 students. We'll call those 2 students Bill and Gloria. So you can see a graphic of this represented on the slide. The data is usually collected concurrently across all the participants, and after 3 to 5 trials, and assuming a stable baseline is established, Bill is introduced to the experimental condition, which is a reading fluency program. So the program is introduced while the other student, Gloria, continues with the baseline condition. After 3 to 5 more trials, Gloria goes into the experimental phase, while Bill continues in the intervention phase. In this example, the dependent variable is the number of words read correctly during a 1-minute time period, and the independent variable was the students, either Bill or Gloria. Another term you'll need to know is multiple baseline across behavior. So this would be if we have one person with two target behaviors. So let's say we want them to stop eating so much sugar and also increase working out. And both of these behaviors change when we introduce the same treatment. So let's say that the treatment we introduced was some type of diet pill, and it caused both their sugar consuming to go down and their exercising to increase. Then we would say that our treatment was the thing that caused the change. And that is what is called a multiple baseline across behavior design. And then we have alternating treatment design, which is used for evaluating the effect of more than one kind of treatment on one individual within the same experiment. So after the baseline phase, different treatments are then alternated several times, and the order of the treatment is randomly determined to control for those carryover effects that we discussed before. The treatment effect is then replicated each time it is introduced, so a treatment may be applied several times. So if you look on the slide, I have a graphic to go with the example I'm about to tell you. So a teacher is interested in increasing her students' rate of reading. She has two fluency programs that she believes may work with Bob. She implements the two different programs on alternate days over 19 days. And after the completion of the experiment, she is confident that that intervention 1 will achieve better results for improving Bob's reading skills. So another single participant design is called changing criterion design or shaping. And it is a single participant design that shapes behavior toward a final goal. And when a behavior reaches a targeted level, then the criterion is changed and the behavior must meet that new level. So the final goal behavior is met kind of in a stepwise fashion. So shaping is the process of teaching a complex behavior by using rewards and rewarding closer and closer approximations, or you could think of approximations as steps, towards a desired behavior. So it would be the reinforcement of simple steps in a behavior that lead to a desired, more complex behavior. So to illustrate the idea of shaping, let's say that we wanted to train this dolphin to jump through a hula hoop. What we could do is put the hula hoop in the water, and when the dolphin just kind of randomly swims up to the hula hoop and comes in contact with it, touches it with its nose or its fin or whatever, then we would reward the dolphin with a fish. And now this association between hula hoop and reward is stamped in the dolphin's mind, so now it might intentionally start coming in contact with the hula hoop in an effort to gain the reward. And that's kind of the idea behind all the steps. They start out random, a reward occurs, which creates an association between that step and the reward, and then the organism starts intentionally doing that behavior. So after we have the hula hoop in the water and the dolphin comes in contact with it, we reward that dolphin with a fish. The next thing that we might do is try to get the dolphin to swim through the hula hoop by dangling a fish on the other side of the hula hoop. And so the fish swims through the hula hoop, or the dolphin swims through the hula hoop and gets the fish. And now this association is made. The next thing that we might do is hold the hula hoop above the water and see if the fish can't, or if the dolphin can't come in contact with the hula hoop. And when it does, we reward it with a fish. And then we hold the hula hoop a little bit higher and we get the dolphin to jump through, again, by dangling the fish on the other side of the hula hoop. And once it jumps through, we reward that behavior. So here we've used shaping to train a dolphin to jump through a hula hoop. So it was B.F. Skinner that also used shaping as part of his learning theories. And in this image here that you see on the screen, he was doing a photo shoot for Look magazine, and he was actually training this Dalmatian to climb a wall using shaping. He would give him a piece of chopped meat every time the dog did a closer and closer step to climbing the wall or getting as high as he could on the wall. So here are a bunch of steps that you would need to do to train someone to hula hoop. imagining that you're in a room and you're putting a hula hoop behind a door, and the person has to figure out that the hula hoop's behind the door, and go find the hula hoop behind the door, and so on and so forth. So using this scenario, what would be the correct order to put the numbers in, because right now they're out of order, to shape this person to hula hoop? So I'm going to tell you the correct order of steps by number. So pause the video if you haven't figured it out yet. But the correct order is 5, 4, 6, 2, 3, 7, 8, 1. And that's changing criterion design. So finally, we'll just look at the advantages and disadvantages of single participant design. So the advantages are that they work well in clinical settings. Researchers can determine cause and effect relationships between a treatment and an individual, and then they can use that treatment on others if it was effective. And also, there are customized conditions with single participant design. So the conditions can be tailored to an individual rather than needing to be standardized for a group of participants. And this allows you to change the treatment midway if it's not working without jeopardizing the integrity of the entire experiment. So, for example, if Johnny still won't sit still after he's been given a treatment to sit still, then you can increase reinforcers or increase the treatment. So researcher is also the one who interprets data in a single participant design. So that can be both a advantage and a disadvantage. But looking at the fact that the researcher interprets their own data as an advantage, some people say that statistics mask the true effect of an independent variable on an IV on behavior by averaging kind of the DV or the effect over or within groups. So when the researcher is able to instead look directly at the effect without the statistical average of the data, then they can get kind of a true measurement. And then the disadvantages to single participant designs are the threats to external validity. So just because the treatment works for one person does not necessarily mean that it will work for everyone. And so that means that perhaps it's not generalizable, which makes it not externally valid. And then another disadvantage is excluded measurements. So experimental analysis of behavior uses response rate as the dependent variable. And this is kind of exclusionary because it doesn't take into account things like reaction time or number of correct items and other kind of frequency counts. And then again, the researcher interpreting the data is a disadvantage as well as an advantage. So here as a disadvantage, there is no statistics on analysis. The analysis is completely subjective. So this leaves the research way open to all kinds of experimenter bias. So that is the end of chapter 9. Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you on the next one.